Hello, my name is Afradi Salmon Mijage from Edukea Tanzania. Welcome in this session to proceed our topic, which is the first topic in Form 5 history, which is from colonialism to First World War. This is our topic which we are proceeding with. And the last session we ended on the measures that shown that colonial states were, it means that the measures or the factors that determined in the establishment of agricultural system in Africa or during the colonial economy. So today we are going to see the methods used by the colonial powers to establish the colonial economy in Africa. The colonial economy was established through creation, destruction, and preservation. It means that the colonial economy in Africa was established through creation, destruction, and preservation. Let us see one method after another. The first method was creation. And what is the definition of creation? It means that creation was the method established by Europeans to introduce new elements that were not existed in the native areas. It means that this was the method whereby the colonialists established and introduced the new elements that were not existed in the native areas. Under creation, new elements were introduced by the colonial powers on the traditional African economy. It means that under creation method, new elements were introduced by the colonial powers on the traditional African economy. These elements included the following. The elements which were introduced by the colonial masters are including things like land alienation. It means that the land alienation. By occupying methods and dividing land. It means that land alienation by occupying method and dividing land. Example, North Tanzania islands were created as the production area while South and Central Tanzania were created as labor reserve. It means that land alienation, for example, in Tanzania, whereby North Tanzania islands were created as the production area while South and Central Tanzania were created as labor reserve. Land alienation involved the grabbing of land from the Africans as a way of getting areas where the growing of cash crops and the mining activities could take place. It means that the Europeans were grabbing the African land in order to get the areas where growing of cash crops and mining activities could take place. It was the fertile land and land with minerals in large quantity that was taken by colonialists. It meant that the land alienation took place on the areas which are the fertility or the fertile soil and the land with the minerals in large quantity that was taken by the colonialists to establish their projects. Land alienation was common in settler economies. It meant that the land alienation was common specifically in settler economies such as Kenya and Zimbabwe. These were areas where land alienation was common. But the second elements which were created was taxation. The colonial powers introduced the taxation as an indirect way of getting cheap labor. It means that the Europeans doing that purposefully in order to get the cheap labor in an indirect way. To pay taxes, the Africans had to sell their labor on the colonial farms. In this way, the colonialists acquired both cheap labor and cash crops that were needed as raw materials in Europe. It means that in this way, the colonialists acquired both cheap labor and cash crops that were highly demanded in the European countries or in Europe. Also, example, art tax, matiti tax, and the edi tax. These were examples of taxation which was introduced in Africa by the colonialists. Let us see another element or third element which were created, which is forced cash crop production. It means that they created the forcing cash crops production by the Africans. It means that the colonial powers forced the Africans to produce cash crops such as coffee, cotton, and sisal, which were needed as raw materials in the European industries. It means that the European power were forcing the Africans to produce cash crops which were in need or which were in high need in the European powers, like coffee, sisal, cotton, and other agricultural products or other cash crops which were needed in the metropolitan. The Africans produced the cash crops at expense of food crops. It means that the Africans produced the cash crops at the expense of food crops. This explains the widespread occurrence of famine in colonial Africa. It means that the Africans were producing cash crops and the food crops were prohibited to be produced, and that led to the famine and hunger among the African countries during the colonial era. Another element that was introduced was introduction of the monetary system. It means that the colonialists during colonial economy, there was introduction of money system as the medium of exchange. It means that the colonialists introduced money as the medium of exchange to get money. The Africans had to sell their labor on the farms, thus the colonialists obtained both the cheap labor and the cash crops which were needs of the colonial economy. It means that the colonialists established or created the introduction or created the monetary system which was acted as the medium of the exchange, and the Africans had no money, so they were supposed to provide their cheap labor in the farms and the plantations as well as mining centers which were established by the colonial powers, and thus the colonialists got both the cheap labor and the cash crops which were needed in the industries as raw materials. Exchange of goods or service by using coins or paper money. It means that the money system that was used or that was introduced or created by the colonialists led to the exchange of goods or service by using coin or paper money. It means that they brought the exchange of goods by using coin or money. So you can see that the money system which was introduced was like this. So they started to use money. These were the medium of exchange. It means that you go to the shop, you buy this tool or this remote, and you pay money to the seller or to the shopkeeper. So this was used as the medium of exchange. So this was the method number one which was used to establish or to introduce colonial economy in Africa. So let us see the second method, which was the extraction method. It means that forced labor were completed to work in the colonial farmers. Forced labor was required to reduce costs that were needed in public service. African chiefs were forced to produce labor at a low cost. So it means that the colonial powers destroyed African traditional industries. By this policy, all industries were to remain in Europe, and Africa was to be a source of market for European manufactured goods and a producer of raw materials. It means that the colonial powers destroyed the African traditional industries. By the policy of industrial were to remain in Europe and African to be the source of raw material producers and to be acting as the source of market for the European manufactured goods. The traditional industries were destroyed in two main ways. force and the competition. To mean that the destruction of African local industries or traditional industries was destructed through two ways. The first one was by using force. Here, different laws were passed by the colonial government that threatened the African from engaging in industrial activities. It means that here the colonialists were passed or enacted different laws that were passed by the colonial governments that threatens the Africans who were engaging themselves in industrial activities. For example, in Congo, one would have his arms chopped off if engaged in industrial activities. For example, in Congo or Democratic Republic of Congo, where if someone would be caught engaging in industrial activities, or their hands or arms could be chopped off. So that was the way whereby the destruction was implemented by using force. Means you force Africans to withdraw from engaging the industrial activities based on local industries or traditional industries in Africa, and to act out to remain Africa as the source of markets and the producer of raw materials for the industries in Europe. Another method that was used under destruction method was competition. Here, the colonial powers imported high quality products from Europe in order to destroy the markets for the local products. Meaning here, the Africans' products were competing with the European products. So the Europeans were highly imported the European manufactured goods that were competing with the local manufactured products in Africa. So the local products which were made in Africa could not compete with the European manufactured goods which are the high quality and they were attractive to the eyes of the Africans. So the Africans could leave the African or their local products and to buy the European quality manufactured goods. So that was another way that would be to distract the African elements. And hence, Africans, after destroying the local or traditional industries in Africa, they decided to establish or to introduce processing industries that were processing the raw materials or agricultural products in order to reduce the burden when they wanted to export the raw materials to Europe in their industries. So the last method that was used to introduce colonial economy in Africa was the preservation method, whereby some elements in Africa were preserved to continue to be implemented or to be used in Africa. The colonialists preserved some elements of the pre-colonial African economies, such as the basic tool of production remained to be the land, or except that this one was imported. To mean that the basic tool of production remained to be the end all, except that this one was imported. There were no improvements in the tools of productive forces. To mean that the basic tool for production remained to be the end all, except those which were imported. So you can see there were no improvements in the tools of production or productive forces, and they decided to preserve those present or existing productive forces. Another category that underlined on preservation method was the pre-capitalist relations of production were preserved. For example, the feudal relations of production, but these served the interests of the colonialists. To mean that the pre-capitalist relations of production were preserved. It means that the relation of production that was existed in Africa after the coming of colonialists, they decided to preserve as feudal mode of production. But this mode of production was intended to serve the interests of the colonialists. Another way that was used under the preservation method was the basic unit of production remained to be the family member. It means that as previous times before the coming of colonialist African or pre-colonial African societies, we are using the family members as the unit of production. So after the arriving of the Europeans, the family member remained to be the basic unit of production. And this limited the division of labor and also hindered the development of science and the technology. To mean that the family member was used as the basic unit in production, and that could not attract the advancement or development of science and technology, because there were no improvement and the employment of the advanced science and the technology in production. So these were the categories which were included in the preservation method as used in the introduction of colonial economy. So let us see another part, which is colonial economy. What is colonial economy? Colonial economy refers to all production and consumption activities found in Africa during the colonial period. It means that the colonial economy refers to all production and consumption activities found in Africa during the colonial period. It means that the Second World War, which took place between 1939 and up to 1945, has a significant impact on the capitalist powers, and they spent huge sum of money financing the war. It is estimated that the loss of Second World War was almost $13 billion. $13 billion. That's 13.8 billion US dollar. So that was just a loss that was got or estimated at the loss of the Second World War. So the colonial economy was the effect of the establishment of colonial economy was the effect of the Second World War that was started in 1939 up to 1945. The destruction of the capitalist economies forced the European powers to introduce various changes in the colonial economy. It means that the destruction of the capitalist economy by the World War II led to the European powers to introduce various changes in the colonial economies. It means that the colonial economy in Africa were experiencing various changes that were made by the European powers, so as to revamp the economy that were distracted by the World War II. Colonial economy was anchored on 5 important sectors, namely, to mean that colonial economy was based on 5 important sectors, or was employed or established on 5 important sectors, which are agriculture, mining, processing industries, commerce, and the transport. So we are going to see one after another. These were sectors which were established after the Second World War. So you can see the main changes were done in these following sectors: agriculture, mining sector, industry, commerce or trade, and the transport system or transport sector. These were the areas which were touched after the effect of Second World War to hit the European powers. So we are going to see one after another. The first one was agriculture. The main aim of colonial agricultural policy was to promote the production of cash crops for export, to feed the industry of the metropolitan states, to feed the metropolitan states. It means the main aim of colonial agricultural policy was to promote the production of cash crops for exportation in order to feed the industries which were hungry in European nations, as also to integrate the Africans into capitalist system through growing cash crops in which they will sell, stimulate capital investment and maximization of profit by buying African crops at low price and paying to low wages. It means that the agriculture was aimed at integrating the Africans into the capitalist system through which growing cash crops in which they would sell those cash crops at sell and stimulate capital investment as well as maximization of profit by buying African crops or cash crops at low price and being paid low wages. So this was the all about agriculture or agricultural sector that was introduced after the changes when the Second World War was ended. 3 types of agriculture were established, namely settler economy. It means that 3 types of agricultural system were established, namely settler economy, plantation economy, and peasant economy. It means that there were 3 types of agricultural economy or agricultural system that were established after the end of the Second World War. The first one was settler economy, plantation economy, and the peasant economy that were introduced under the colonial economy. Let us see the first type of agriculture economy. The peasant. This involved the small-scale production of cash crops by individuals for the purpose of coming cash and providing food for survival of colonial rule. It means that the Africans were producing both the cash crops and the food for their survival during colonial rule. It means the Africans were involving in small-scale production of agricultural products such as cash crops and food crops for the purpose of providing or producing cash and providing food for survival during the colonial rule. The peasant and the cash crops forms of agriculture were earlier transferring part of subsistence farming to the cash sector, but they create part of the pre-colonial system of products, social control, and change. To mean that the peasant and the cash crops forms of agriculture were transferring part of subsistence farming to the cash sector, whereby they create the part of the pre-colonial system of products, social control, and change. It means that the social control was unchanged, but the subsistence farming was changed to be the cash sector. It means that they transferred from the subsistence production to the cash production. So the Africans was involved or started to involve themselves in production of cash crops and food crops. For example, in Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Western Nigeria, the British colonial administration wanted the peasants to devote much of their time and energy to the cultivation of cocoa and coffee. It means that the areas like Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Western Nigeria, where the British colonial administration wanted the peasants to engage themselves much of their time and energy to cultivate cocoa and coffee. Let us see the characteristics of peasant agriculture. The first one was, it was based on land units which were very small beds of the big as being directly populated. It means that it was based on the land units which were very small bed of the big as being directly populated. It means that the peasant agriculture was done in the small area, or the land unit which were very small and were highly populated. Another, there were individual ownership of land. It means that there were individual ownership of land in areas where peasant agriculture was established. But another was, there were intercropping in order to maintain various cash crops at the same time. It means that there were mixing of both cash crops and food crops in order to maintain the needs of each interest. It means that they were planting or growing the cash crops for their needs, or to feed the demands of the colonialists. At the same time, they were producing the food crops for their survival. Another was elementary tools such as oars and arrows were used as instruments of labor. It means that the elementary tools such as hand oars and the arrows were used as instruments of labor. And the last one was, there was hardly any use of scientific methods of farming. It means that there were no use of scientific method of farming, but rather than the using of local methods of farming, whereby the poor methods of farming were used. There were no use of fertilizers, so there was use of manual fertilizer, and no use the industrial fertilizers, as well as no scientific methods which were employed in peasant agriculture. So after looking the characteristics of peasant agriculture, I would like to wind up there and to give you the exercise which you have to perform in order to increase the knowledge and understanding concerning with the agricultural system or agricultural economy that were introduced during colonial economy. And the exercise comprises two questions, which the first one is, what were the methods used to establish colonial economy in Africa? And the second one was the explain the characteristics of peasant agriculture. It means that these are two questions which you have to perform yourself, either individually or in groups. So that will enable you or will assist you to increase the skills and knowledge as well as understanding concerning what I have taught in this lesson. So I would like to thank you for listening and watching, and I wish you the good preparation in your studies, and I welcome you in the next session. So bye bye, have a good